Hi guys, this is Zach from Watches on You, and today I'm going to be taking a look at another Grand Seiko. So I'd just like to mention right away that we're at JB Hudson Jewelers. They lent us this piece for the purposes of this review, and this watch is the Grand Seiko SBGE201 Spring Drive GMT. So right away here, I'm going to go over this watch's 44mm stainless steel case. Now, the case on this watch is finished very, very nicely. You get this nice polishing on the sides of the case. Looks great. And the brushing also as well, you can see it lines up perfectly down the watch. There's really no blemishes that I have found, and that's one of the kind of things that they really upgraded with the Grand Seiko line compared to the regular Seiko line, which obviously is a lot cheaper. So again, yeah, the finishing of this is really, really up to high luxury standards. I'd say it's for sure comparable to Rolex. Just the brushing and everything, it looks absolutely stunning in the light, and so does the polishing as well. You get this beautiful signed crown right there with a nice kind of bead blasted background, and then raised G and S for Grand Seiko. So, moving now to the dial of this watch. The dial of this watch is a nice black dial, and it's done very nicely. I like the metal indices. Now, it isn't as kind of, I'd say, elegant as a lot of other luxury watches. It is a bit more geared towards a more sporty aspect, and I wish that the indices would have been a little bit less kind of more geared towards that, as it does kind of have some of the looks that make it more look like a cheaper Seiko. Now, obviously, this is much higher quality, and I've already said that, but I will say just kind of making the indices that shape, it kind of makes it look more like some of the cheaper Seiko watches, which I don't really like, but it still does look nice. You get these nice broad hands, and you can see that those are loomed. The indices at 12, 3, 6, and 9 are also loomed, and you get a nice loomed GMT hand as well. Now, I like how the GMT hand is done in red, as it makes it really pop off the dial, and you can, if you want, you can really differentiate it from the other hands, so you would never really get confused between the GMT hand and the hour hand, or the GMT hand and the minute hand. It should be pretty straightforward when you're reading this dial. Now, you also get a power reserve near 9 o'clock right there, and that's a very useful feature, as it just lets you know when you're going to wind down. And you also have a date window at around 4 o'clock right there. Now, the date window, as you can see, it has no magnifier, but it is large enough, I'd say, to easily read. Really no problems with that. I'd say all the hand finishing on the dial is done very, very nicely. You can see it's fairly legible. I don't think you should really have a problem with that. And you also have a nice GMT bezel going around the outside. Now, this is a bi-directional GMT bezel. So what that means is you could actually do a maximum of 3 time zones if you'd like by manipulating the bezel, instead of just the regular 2, as if this bezel was fixed. So it is done in a 24-hour, and GMT hands are almost all, well, really, from whatever I'm familiar with, are always 24-hour, just because then that way you know whether it's AM or PM in the city that you're talking about, because if it's on the other side of the world, it could be opposite from you, and that'd obviously be a good thing to know. So it is bi-directional. The action is good. It locks down nice and tight. It really just is done nicely. You can see that it clicks in very well, and there are really no problems with the bezel at all. Now, one other interesting feature about this bezel is that, as you can see that there's a piece of almost glass over the indicators on the bezel, and that actually is because that is covered in sapphire crystal. So that way your bezel insert will never really scratch. And that is one of the main problems with bezels on watches, is that they tend to be one of the hot spots for scratches. This watch, you'll never really have to worry about that, because it has a sapphire crystal over it. Now, one of the other more famous watches that did that is the Blancpain 50 Fathoms, which has a sapphire ring over its diving bezel. Now, this has it over the GMT bezel, so that adds a nice feature to this piece as well. You also get the main crystal is also sapphire as well. Now, one thing I will say is it seems like the GMT bezel isn't quite coated against reflections. It seems to reflect a bit more than the regular main crystal, but that isn't really a problem, as that's the GMT bezel and you shouldn't be using it too much. So now let's move on to a wrist shot. So before I actually put it on the wrist, I'll talk about the clasp. The clasp is done nicely. You can see no pressed metal here. It's got nice bars going all across, fairly thick enough for sure. Feels high quality. It's just push button, which I really like. Is some of the regular just kind of pop them off with no buttons. They can be a little bit finicky. So this push button, fine there totally, and I get this nice Grand Seiko seal too on the clasp. So on the wrist, this watch feels very, very nice. It's a 44mm case, so it does wear quite large. If you have a very small wrist, that might be an issue, but I would say the fit is quite nice. There's really no hot spots here of scratching or hair pulling. I haven't felt any, at least yet. And the bracelet also forms the shape of your wrist very, very nicely. I have a 7-inch wrist, so take that for reference. Now, if anything, this watch really, it just feels nice on the wrist. There's really no complaints here. Feels very, very high quality. Now, the only bad thing I can say about this watch is, personally, I'm not a huge fan of how they made the bezel go so wide on it. I wish it would have been a little bit more kind of subdued in the design, but that's a total personal nitpick, and it really doesn't shine anything bad on the quality of this watch. So there are really no problems there. And so this watch actually, one other interesting thing about this watch is it features the spring drive movement. So the spring drive movements, they function almost like mechanical movements. So they have a automatic winding rotor, and they have a mainspring, and they have timing gears. They have almost everything that a mechanical movement would have, except they have a different regulator. So the regulator in a spring drive movement is actually a quartz crystal. Now, how it works is the quartz crystal will vibrate to create a kind of set time. So it will vibrate, I believe it's around 32,000 times, I believe a minute roughly there. And so what that will vibrate around, and then that will set kind of the time, and that will be the regulator. Now, that regulation then goes to the timing wheels, where it is acted upon by certain magnets and special things to regulate the watch. Now, what this does is this provides more accuracy than a traditional mechanical movement would offer, as this watch is really, it can have an accuracy of plus minus 15 seconds a month, which is really half a second a day. So this watch is far, far more accurate than really any mechanical watch I can think of in terms of accuracy. It's just, you really, really will almost never have to worry about resetting this watch due to its accuracy. So that's definitely an advantage of the spring drive movement. Now, a disadvantage of the spring drive movement is that I can imagine it would be very, very costly to service, just because there's that added quartz crystal in there with the other gears. So that might drive up the servicing cost, but the accuracy will still be much better than a traditional movement. So here you have the Grand Seiko Spring Drive GMT watch, and it's definitely one of the more unique looking watches out there, and definitely one of just the more unique watches in general, as it has their spring drive movement. So thank you guys for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.